it is a real opportunity for us to have somebody who is, if you read the literature, a very important figure in advancing the state of knowledge about the geosciences in particular. And just a little bit of background, of all of the STEM areas, the geosciences, which broadly includes oceanography, atmospheric science, and geology, are the worst of all in performing in terms of getting underrepresented groups into the pipeline. And so our speaker's talk today is part of her ongoing research to understand how to better communicate with underrepresented groups and others. And I think it's just going to be a fascinating discussion. So with that bit of introduction, I'll leave the actual full introduction to our Seagull people.
Thank you. All right, that was great. So I'll just do a little bit of the necessary virtual seminar type stuff. First of all, welcome everyone. I think this is our fourth, but I'm not well known for my counting ability, so we'll just skip that one. So the everyone who's joining in should just keep their camera off and stay muted. And the way that we will field the questions is you guys will send them directly to me through the chat, which you can see at the bottom in the Zoom window. So if you message them to me at any time during the talk, I will eventually bring it back to that point at the end when we're doing the Q&A, and I'll just facilitate that. So if you have a question in the middle that you think of, before you forget it, just message it to me, and we will definitely get to it. And so this meeting's being recorded, and I guess we'll just move on to the introductions. So our speaker today is Dr. Karen McNeil, who's a Millett Endowed Professor of Geosciences at Auburn University. She did her BS in Marine Science at Eckerd College and the Master's in Oceanography at Texas A&M. And the PhD was also at Texas A&M in geology. And her current research interests include geoscience education, geocognition, and active learning. And she utilizes a range of qualitative and quantitative tools, including psychomotor tools, psychometric tools, and open-ended approaches. And we're also joined by Elijah Johnson, who has a BA in Earth Science from James Madison and an MS in Geology from Auburn, and is currently a second-year PhD student studying Earth System Science at Auburn. And his research interests include geoscience education, learning technology applications such as augmented reality, and spatial thinking across disciplines. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our speaker, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get my PowerPoint going. Can everyone see my slide?
Yes, I see it.
Awesome. Well, I just want to say thank you all so much for inviting Elijah and I to give you this presentation. And we're really excited to share with you some of our work in geoscience education and geocognition. But before I get into the research that we're doing, I wanted to take a step back and tell you a little bit about what discipline-based education research is. DBER is an emerging field that is really highly embedded in a discipline, a parent discipline, in this case, the geosciences. And we investigate teaching and learning, and it's informed by other fields such as cognitive science, science education, and psychology. And it's most often applied to higher education, but you can be a DBER researcher and also look at informal education and K-12 education. And if you're not familiar with this book, written by Jill Singer and others, that was released by the National Research Council, that's a great background on what discipline-based education research is. And along with geoscience education, or GER, or GER, however you want to say it, we have physics ed, chemistry ed, and a whole bunch of other fields that have similar counterparts to GER. GER is one of the newer fields, along with astronomy education, but also recently ASER, or atmospheric science education, has come to the table within the geosciences. And even though we might be one of the newer DBER disciplines, since this report came out at the National Science Foundation in 1997, we have been working towards where we are today. And NSF recommended that the GEO and EHR directorates start supporting GeoEd in 1997, documenting that DBER was alive and well in physics and chemistry. Why was it not alive and well in the geosciences? So since then, there's been a number of funding opportunities at the NSF in both the Geo and EHR directorate support that are directed towards geoscience education. And just to tell you a little bit more about myself, I'm sort of considered a border crosser. So I started my career in marine science and understanding coastal hypoxia, really kind of off the Louisiana coast. And then I went to geology, where I looked at soil volatile organic compounds. And I continued into doing biogeochemistry as well as geoscience education as part of my dissertation, where I had half of my dissertation in GeoEd, and it was kind of risky at the time. We didn't have the setup, but we do now. But I remember my advisor saying, well, you know, this could crash and burn. So luckily it didn't. And I started my first tenure track position at Mississippi State, where I continued both strands of research in biogeochemistry and geoscience ed. And then in 2013, I took a position at NC State, where I 100% transitioned or board across to doing geoscience ed as my sole research area. And I've continued since. And now I have a great lab group at Auburn. I was hired here to start the DBER initiative, where we now have myself and a faculty member in chemistry and a faculty member in biology, and we're hiring 2 more, one in math and one in physics this year. So this is my group at Auburn. We do a number of different areas of research that are listed here. We're going to be talking to you about the ones in red today: broadening participation, student engagement in undergraduate classrooms when we think about active learning. And Eli is going to be talking to you a little bit about his work in spatial thinking. He's the one doing that work in my group now. But do realize we do a lot of other work. I'm not going to be able to present to you today about some of the work we do in climate change. But if you're interested, I'd be glad to talk to you afterward. And along with that, I'm going to have a shameless plug at the end about our new NSF NRT program and climate resilience. So with that all said, I'd like to now let Eli introduce himself and tell you a little bit about his work that he does both in his master's and now into his PhD, to give you an idea and give you a sense of, okay, if this is what a graduate student looks like who's doing DBER within the discipline. His PhD is in Earth System Science. And also I want to say, I want to toot his horn for him a little bit. He's an NSF GRFP awardee as well with the work in spatial thinking. So take it away, Eli.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Elijah Johnson. And like Karen said, I started with my master's in geology here. And one of my first projects getting here, my thesis, was the effectiveness of the augmented reality sandbox for improving spatial thinking in undergraduates. If you don't know what the AR sandbox is, it's this thing right here. It's essentially an interactive topographic map used to teach topographic map skills, watersheds, those types of things. So the geosciences is a really, really spatially intensive field, and there are a lot of spatial skills that we may employ. Spatial thinking kind of encompasses a lot of different spatial skills. So I wanted to look at, what spatial skills are we actually training in the geosciences, specifically with topographic maps. And in this thesis, I essentially created a training activity designed with critical student feedback. So I got a lot of the challenges and the strategies that students have with spatial thinking and incorporated that into the development of the activity. And I also evaluated the effectiveness of this activity with training spatial skills. And we saw specific skills like spatial visualization, which is a very complex multi-step manipulation process, to be very, very difficult. So we have to think of ways to activate that skill a little bit more. That was one of the things that we learned in this study. Another component of Project One was basically to see what the spatial distribution was amongst our undergraduate population. So who was scoring high, who was scoring lower, who was scoring in the middle. We wanted to know all of that information as well. We collected a lot of demographics as well. When we're thinking about spatial thinking studies, they're primarily done with undergraduates. So moving into Project Two, we wanted to take that same spatial assessment and apply it to the general public and see what that spatial distribution was across that population. So we developed a survey here designed to understand the public's beliefs, experiences with, and confidence in the strength of their spatial reasoning. That gives us an idea of how these skills are transferred from undergrad or from college into the general public, excuse me. So that was project 2. So this is what's been going on in the geoscience education research side. And then moving on into GIS and health. So this actually came out of, I'm enrolled in the GIS certificate program. And this actually came out of a GIS class. I wanted to be involved in a project that, looked at, that I could use beyond just the class, something that could be applied in someone else's research or in my own research or publish or present. So one of those was exploring spatial relationships between lignite-bearing aquifers, total organic carbon, and end-stage renal disease. So we kind of see this spatial pattern of end-stage renal disease or kidney disease in Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas. And we basically wanted to see if these aquifers that contain lignite were causing or could be causing this kidney disease. So my part of the project was to basically acquire these ESRD rates, get population and demographic data at the zip code level and generate the rates for these, and also do a hotspot analysis. So this was my component of this project. We'll actually be presenting that at GSA this year. And lastly, for these projects, I'm also involved in the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. And the goal here for this project is basically, to explore the effects of the heat island effect locally and impacts to human health outcomes. So thinking about small towns like Auburn, what is the effect of the heat island here? And there's a really big undergraduate mentorship component here as well. So we'll be taking on some undergrads, 2 undergrads actually, and I'll be actually helping them through this project to create a deliverable, which is a story map at the end of this project. So, and then moving on to teaching and service. So as a graduate student, I'm getting a PhD, so I would like to teach. So this experience that I've had has been, invaluable. I was a teaching assistant for concepts of science in our department here at Auburn. And I'm also an adjunct instructor at Auburn University at Montgomery, teaching Introduction to Earth Science. This is a class primarily for non-majors, even though we do have a few environmental science majors in the course, which I really find rewarding and invaluable, as I said. Some other things that I'm passionate about is diversity and inclusion work, especially in the geosciences. We do have very low participation from minoritized groups. So one of the things that I seek to change is, that demographic. I want to include more people in the geosciences and in STEM. So out of our Inclusion, Equity, and Diversity office here at COSAM, we created a task force designed to do just that. We have certain goals in place to increase, outreach, recruitment, and retention efforts in STEM and in the geosciences specifically. So we have a task force for our department as well, which I'm also serving on. And we also have a lot of K-12 outreach. Kids have to be introduced to geosciences really, really early. And we like to think that we're planting these seeds of, learn about the earth. These are the things that we do as geoscientists. And this is something that you can do easily. So a lot of that is with just, visibility. And a lot of that is, sparking interest in students, which they really do with this AR Sandbox. So this is from Destination STEM, where a lot of students from K-12 from the surrounding counties come to Auburn and actually see what geoscientists do. So I have a huge role in this as well. So that is me as a graduate student in geoscience education. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you, Eli. So I wanted to highlight Eli a bit because he is a great example of what someone in geoscience education research who's getting their PhD might do. We're going to hear from him at the end of the presentation. He's going to tell us about one more project that's going to extend some work that I'm going to tell you about. And so what I want to move into now is the research outline for today's talk on what I'm going to present to you with some of our research findings. And so the first part of the talk, we're going to learn a little bit about a survey, national survey that we conducted with faculty, and they basically told us the type of teaching practices that they utilize in the classroom. In our part of the work, we're looking specifically at what inclusive teaching practices were faculty reporting that they were using. And the second part of the talk, I'm going to tell you a little bit about student engagement in two ways. One, in the active learning in the classroom, as well as when the second one is when they're problem solving 3D visualizations. And I'm going to tell you about two different methodologies that we employ in my lab. One is skin sensors, which can look at skin conductance as a proxy for engagement, and then also eye tracking, which is exactly what it sounds like, that can tell you a little bit about what someone is looking at and how they're spending their visual attention. And really the idea of part two is that it informs part one. As geoscience education researchers, we can get information about how students are, what troubles, the difficulties they're having, what are they doing, how is different teaching modalities impacting students, and that can inform our teaching practices in the classroom. So there's this synergy between these different types of research that I'm going to present to you. So as was mentioned by your dean at the beginning, if you don't already know, if it's not already apparent, we know that in the geosciences, we're one of the least diverse disciplines in STEM. And here's an example of data from 2019 that pretty much illustrates that with the African American population, where in the middle, here's the Earth, Atmospheric, and Ocean Sciences, and we can see that we are far below all the other STEM fields listed. When we look at Latinx community, we are we're doing better. The scale has changed on the x-axis, but we're still mostly under that 10% line, except for those gaining associate degrees. So we clearly can do better. And the question is, how do we do so? Well, there's a lot of things that we could go to and look at that influence these things. I'm going to present on these bullet points today on the things that we can maybe control a little bit more as we teach and learn in the undergraduate classroom. And because we know that our undergraduate choices for how we teach can influence the students that we have, or that may decide not to enroll in our class, for instance. And so the things that I want to focus on are three of the influential factors that came up from research in 2020. One that were self-reported from underrepresented minorities. One was their own personal motivation, which we may or may not be able to do a lot about unless we motivate them through some of the topics that we teach about. There are also their perceptions of the learning experience. What is it going to be like? And then also their ability to link careers or jobs with the given discipline. And so this is clearly some things that we might want to focus on. Also reported in a work that I published with Dr. Sherman Morris, URM students tend to favor helping society and the environment. And so certainly our field does that, and maybe we should be advertising that a little bit more. So this first study, I'm going to tell you, as I mentioned before, I'm going to give you our results for what we saw that instructors reported on their teaching practices. And this was published in the Journal of Geoscience Education last year. And we really wanted to know which of these practices seem to support diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so we had this National Geoscience Faculty Service, maybe some of you have completed this survey. It's been conducted every 4 years since about, I think, 2002. So we utilized the results from the 2016 survey because there were actual questions that referred to the topic we were interested in. About 10,000 geoscience instructors were contacted, and we had a little over 2,600 respond to the survey. Faculty were asked questions about their content and methods that they taught in both intro or major courses. We utilized 26 items from this survey that through the literature related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And all of these various organizations shown on this slide supported the work of this project. And the survey that we utilized, as I mentioned before, had 26 items we selected. 22 of those items loaded on 4 factors. Geoscience representations, which were, we asked faculty whether they showed pictures and images and told stories about geoscientists. We asked, the second one was curricular choices, which we asked what kind of topics they covered. And then learning strategies, we asked what kind of support do they provide students specifically in regard to self-reflection, how to study, helping low performers and things like that. And then lastly, career pathways, which is pretty self-explanatory. How do they incorporate career pathways into their teaching? How do they talk about careers? What kind of opportunities do they provide? How do they support students to learn about careers? And for those of you who are into survey statistics, we've included some of that here. We only included items that loaded on our factor analysis over 0.3, and we had a really good Cronbach's alpha, which is basically our reliability of our questions for each of these factors. Okay, so moving into the first factor, here are respondents. And we can see when they were asked how frequently they included photos and stories of individual geoscientists and their work. And when asked several times, about 39% of our respondents said that they talked through photos and stories within their class several times a semester. But when they were asked, of those that said yes, what percentage of the geoscientists that they talk about were female, we get a much lower percent, where about half of those that actually talked and showed images and stories and included females, which was a lower percentage that we began with, most of them less than 30% of the time. And we know that females represent over 50% of the geosciences now, and so we obviously can do a little better with that percentage. When they were asked about how many of these stories or images included people of color, well, 82% said less than 10%. So clearly we could do a lot better in telling stories and including people of color who are geoscientists. So getting into our second factor, curricular choices. We were interested in how they connected the content they were learning to the lives of their students, whether they included problems of national and global interest, whether they linked their learning to social issues, including environmental issues and environmental justice issues, etc. So what we found is that the things to the right which are really social scientific issues, are less often included. And it really drops off when we start looking at environmental justice issues or community inspired issues. And if you remember, some of the information I said earlier with the background from the literature says that underrepresented students really want to help their communities, really want to be involved in environmental type of projects. So we clearly can do a better job of linking some of our content to these issues. So the third factor, learning strategies, we were interested in how instructors supported their students to reflect on what was successful of their own learning, what effective study strategies they're using and problem solving, whether they helped students form study groups, whether they helped students evaluate how effective their study skills and time management skills were, and so forth. And we can see that a lot of our respondents are doing these things, but where it starts to drop off is this last point where supporting less successful groups based on their performance and data within their own class. So we can obviously do a little bit better job of supporting less successful groups within our own classes. And so the last factor that I want to talk to you about is career pathways. And we can see that we do a really pretty good job, at least, of introducing geoscience careers, at least some information about them, that we tend to connect workforce skills with assignments. About half of our respondents are doing this, I should say. And that we do highlight geology and geoscience alumni. And then as we look down the list, promoting internships, communicating about careers and how they're prepared for their career, helping with applications and things like that, it starts to drop off. But really where it drops off the most is allowing students to explore the various careers that are available in the geosciences. And that is likely where we need to up this a little bit, especially since one of those factors that I brought up earlier was with underrepresented minority students who really want to know that there's going to be a job for them at the end, and they need to know this while they're taking the classes that we offer. And also part of the advertising for recruitment is something that we need to consider doing this as well. And so just to tell you a little bit about some of the statistical analysis that we did, I'm not going to go into all the details, but we were curious as to how these instructional practices differ across a suite of variables, and which of these variables were predictive of some of these inclusive practices. And so we had a number of significant predictors within our study. I'm going to focus on two of them: course type and teaching style. And so what you're seeing here is a radar graph, and you see our 4 factors that are shown in each of the points: the geoscience representations, curricular choices, learning strategies, and career pathways. And then the pink dotted lines or dots are intro courses, and the highlighted line is major courses. And so what we find is that two of the areas are statistically different between these course types. One is career pathways, and the other one is curricular choices. So with the major courses, we're doing a much better job of telling our students about career pathways, which makes sense because they're in the major. But we could also be doing that with intro courses so that students who are in our biggest classes hear this information as well. And curricular choices, they are statistically different again, and that is, just to remind you, that is the type of content we cover. So whether it's content related to larger problems, environmental issues, and things like that. And so we may be doing a little better job in our intro courses, which makes sense, but we want to continue doing that throughout the trajectory of a student's career. The two things that were not statistically different were the geoscience representations and the different types of learning strategies that faculty are employing, which is interesting. And perhaps that means we're either doing a really good job or a really poor job in both. But certainly we have room for improvement. And then teaching style, I'm going to highlight here. We have active learning, which I'll talk more about later. You probably have heard this term. So when students are engaging, we have active lecture, which is basically, if you're in a lecture classroom, you may not be able to engage in the same way, but the students are still engaging. It's not purely a didactic lecture, whereas traditional lecture is more didactic. And what we saw here is that the active learning group stood out in all, or at least 3 of the areas: career pathways, learning strategies, and curricular choices. So if you teach with active learning, you're tending to do those things in a different manner, and also the traditional lecture is not. So that's our biggest difference, where those that teach traditionally maybe aren't doing some of those other things. However, all of them are doing similar things when it comes to geoscience representations, which probably points to we need to improve in that area in all of our teaching and in our intro and major courses, as mentioned earlier. So recommendations from this work basically says we need to include more photos and stories, especially those from underrepresented groups. We need to incorporate social scientific issues in the classes we teach. We need to include active learning, which I'm going to go into in the next study about. And we need to help students become aware of the type of learning, that strategies that they employ and where they can do better. And we need to provide more geoscience career information to both intro and major students. And one thing I didn't talk as much about, but we have data on, that those that talk about teaching actually do a better job in inclusive teaching practices. And so we need to help find ways to help faculty talk about their teaching with their other colleagues, and specifically how to talk about teaching in meeting underrepresented populations, and also being inclusive across the board for all students. Okay, so that is the first study. That's kind of this high, hopefully I haven't lost too many people. I can't see you, so I hope you're still engaged. But the second part is really, I want to talk about this idea of active learning a little bit more, and how we've measured how it truly does impact student engagement in the classroom. And so without further ado, we did this in a intro biology classroom. And if you're not familiar, you probably heard the word active learning. Another word that's used is reform-based teaching and learning. It can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. And I'm not going to sit and say you have to do it one way or another. Active learning, there's so many different things you can do. The bottom line premise is that the student is engaged. They're not sitting there like a blank vessel that we're just pouring information into, that they are engaging within the learning process. And so we know that these type of strategies increases retention rates, reduces the achievement gap among a variety of student populations. And then the geosciences, it's critically important for recruitment, retention, and diversity issues. And that, but we don't have a great way of measuring what we would call engagement. So we can observe and kind of say, yeah, they look engaged, or they're working with someone, so they must be engaged. Or we can have self-reflection and have them tell us, yeah, I felt engaged. What we're introducing in this research is having students wear skin sensors or GSR, galvanic skin response systems, where we could truly measure real time their engagement. And again, because we don't want our students to be looking like this in the classroom, we want them all to be engaging. We know intuitively that that is something we want. We know learning has to take place with engagement, right? And we know that that's part of the learning process. And so we ask the question, how do students' engagement levels change as a result of pedagogical approach? And when we look at engagement, it can include a variety of things. We've got behavioral, emotional, and cognitive engagement. And luckily for us, when we measure engagement using the GSR device, and I'm going to tell you more about in a minute, we can capture all of those things. Now, we can't always discern all of those things, but we know that it is measuring those things because that's all part of the sympathetic activation system that I'm going to describe now. Basically, what happens when someone is stimulated by an external stressor or physical, they're involved in a physical sport, or they're taking a test, the sympathetic active nervous system is activated. And that sends a signal to the sweat glands to release moisture. And it doesn't have to be that you have to be pouring down sweat shown in this picture while taking an exam. It can be very small changes that can be detected through skin conductance using this GSR device, which is shown here as like a watch that one would wear around their wrist. And so we deployed this work. When I first learned about these things, I said, well, I want to see if this actually works in the classroom. I haven't seen a bunch of research in the classroom. Why not? Let me try it. And so I did this with a small pilot study that was published in 2014 in JGE when I was traditionally lecturing, when students were doing group work, and when they were watching a movie. And here's what some of the data looked like that I published then. These are 3 different students, student 1, 2, and 3. And you can see in red is when they were engaging in dialogue or group work. The green is when they were watching a movie, and the blue is lecture. And you can see in all 3 cases, my lecturer is not as entertaining as, or at least not as engaging. Maybe it was entertaining, but it's not as engaging as the dialogue and the movie. And I was like, well, that's interesting. So maybe we can use this method for really looking at engagement of the students in the class. So we went ahead and did a larger research study with an intro biology class taught by the same instructor. One was an active learning section, and the other one was traditional learning. And we employed a number of different methodologies. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the pre-post conceptual knowledge assessment that we deployed. And we had students wear skin sensors. We also observed the classroom to see what was going on in the classroom so we can document it and align some of the skin sensor results with that. We used the COPUS observation system. And lastly, we asked students who wore the skin sensor to self-reflect about their engagement in the classroom. And just to be clear that our 2 activities were indeed different, we can see that our COPUS results showed the traditional lecture on the left. And in the orange, we see that that traditional lecturer spent at least 62% of the time lecturing. And this is the average of 5 different classes that we observed for each traditional lecture and active learning. And we can also see some differences where the traditional lecture class did not have any working in group time, and had a whole lot less of other time, which includes just some of the codes that aren't already defined, but they were doing different things. And that's the point here. And when we look at our skin conductance results, I'm going to show you 2 examples of a student who wore the skin conductance in the traditional class and one that wore in the active learning class. And you'll see for yourself what the differences look like. So at the top is the traditional lecture class. This line that is up and down is our benchmark and calibration period. So we utilize this percent change calculation in order to get the percent change between when the teaching occurred and when we had this baseline. And you can see in the first case that the student was actually more engaged, or at least had a higher EDA, electrodermal activation reading, than they did actually in the class itself. And you can see that in the lecture class, it's very flatlined. When we move to the bottom graph and we look at how this particular student responded to the various activities that were occurring, which was documented by our COPAS observation tool, we can see that one, the in-class period is higher than the baseline period, and there's a lot of different things happening. They're definitely being stimulated in different ways, and certainly during the group work, we're seeing higher stimulation and discussion. And so when we look at all of the total N, those were two examples, we can see when we calculate that percent change in engagement that our traditional lecture actually went down. Their engagement goes down and in a negative way, and that was statistically significant within that group. In our active learning group, our percent engagement goes up more than 10%. And we had high standard deviations. That's unfortunately just part of the GSR collection. But we can see that there are some differences here. And it aligns with the self-reported data that we asked for, where the active learning group were reported being more engaged than the traditional lecture. We also did some correlation analysis, and those that were listening mostly when they were doing listening activities, their skin conductance was negatively correlated, and those that were working in groups had a higher or positive correlation in skin conductance, and all of these things were statistically significant. And one last thing that I want to say is that, because all of us really care about content more than anything probably, is, well, does this improve content knowledge? And many other research has shown this, but in this study we collected it too. And what I want you to focus on is in orange is the traditional lecture group, and in red is the active learning group. And just by chance, our traditional lecture group actually had a statistically significantly higher pretest score than our active learning group. But in the end, those differences were no longer statistically different, and the active learning group actually had a significant pre-post difference in their scores. And so once again, we see that active learning did support the content knowledge gains in this way. So ultimately, I've basically been able to show you how skin sensors can be useful in looking at engagement, and that active learning does seem to promote engagement and higher content gains. And so, you know, we should try to do active learning when we can. And I'm not saying we can do this all the time. I mean, and it's certainly not, even in the case that I showed you, lecture still happened, but there were other things that also happened that allowed students to engage. Okay, so I have one more study that I want to tell you about. I hope you're still in there with me. It's going to switch gears just a little bit, and it's really going to start diving down into this field of geocognition, where we're going to look and think about how students engage with spatial diagrams. If you're a geology major, this diagram may look familiar to you. It's a block diagram. And as Eli mentioned earlier, spatial thinking is one of those skills that's really important in our field, but really important in the geological sciences. And it is a malleable skill. It's a skill that can be learned. We often, however, don't do a great job at training students to build the skill up from the beginning of the careers to the end. But it's one of those skills that might be a gateway skill to success in the geological sciences. So we want to be able to do this for all students so that they don't drop out or decide to pursue a different major, or get to their end classes and realize, oh wow, I don't know how to do this, and they have a lot of catching up to do. And so, as Eli mentioned earlier, spatial thinking is a mental process of representing, analyzing, and drawing inferences. In geology, we really rely on penetrative thinking, which is when you have to look or think about what the interior of a surface is like, from visible parts of the exterior of the surface. And we often have to use 2D images that represent 3 and 4D phenomenon. So these are things that geologists should be interested in. This is a typical cross section that's shown in an intro geology course, where we have to look at succession and try to organize and think about what layers occurred in what order and things like that. So we were interested in tracking students' eye patterns when they were looking at some of these visualizations, and specifically we were looking at high and low performers. So eye tracking is a tool that we borrowed from the cognitive sciences to really be able to understand this phenomenon. And eye tracking is sort of the eye candy, I think, of geosciences, because we are such a visual field and there's so much we can learn from when we employ eye tracking about how people are engaging with the visuals we produce. Eye tracking aim is to identify and analyze patterns of visual attention when they're engaging with a visual scene, such as shown here. The assumption is that where the eye goes, the brain follows. And you can have a setup as shown on this, where you have an eye tracking device that's attached to a monitor, and through infrared, basically the light shines in the pupil of the eye and can track very closely where the pupil is looking within the screen, and it does it very precisely. And what we get as an output are these ideas of fixation and saccades, so these measurements. And in the circles are the fixations, and the lines in between them are saccades. Saccades, you're essentially blind. You're not really processing information. You're just going from one fixation point to another. And it works because we know our fixation attention is actually quite narrow, as you can see here. We may see things in our periphery, but what we end up focusing on is actually fairly narrow. And the larger the circle, means that the person is attending to that point for a longer period of time. And here is Eli shown with our TX300 in our lab, where we can collect information with students. Here's a graph that we've shown a student, and here are some of the eye patterns of that student. And what's really neat about this technology is that we can employ what are called areas of interest, and we can draw around certain scenes that we're interested in, and then get some really neat statistics. How often are they looking within that box? How many times do they go back to it? How long does it take for them to get there? How long do they spend there? And things like that. So with using these geologic blocks, there's an assessment that was already developed. So we were able to use that assessment. And within this assessment, there are embedded distractors within the options that a student can choose that are common mistakes that students make, such as looking at parallel surface area error, or making perpendicular surface error, or parallelogram error, which corresponds to each of these spaces here, highlighted in the corresponding color. Okay, so we're going to look at some of these errors that students make and interpret where they're looking and why they might make these errors. We pre-tested the students with the full test, and then we eye tracked 5 of the questions. And we utilized both undergraduate and grads, and based upon their scores, initial scores, we divided them into high and low performing groups. And here is the heat map of some of this eye tracking data: high performers on the left, low performers on the right. And basically we can see that the high performers are doing something that looks to be different than the low performers. They are focusing on this intersection in this top right corner, where the low performers seem to be looking down from this top face and a little bit on the side face, but not focusing on the corner. And what we find, because of this technique, it seems that the high performers are getting more correct and not doing this parallelogram error that is happening with the low performers. In another case, with another example, we can see the difference between the high performers and low performers. Again, high performers on the left, low performers on the right. And again, the low performers seem to be looking down into this parallelogram or looking straight down. And so they're making mostly 2 errors: that parallelogram error again, and what we're calling straight in error of looking straight down perhaps. The high performers are doing something a little different. They are looking at some of the same areas, but they also included looking at this side face, which allowed them to get this answer more correct than the low performers. Some straight in error is being made, but not as frequently. And so The last point I want to bring up that eye tracking can tell us a little bit about is that we see with the low performers, again on the right, that they're looking at all the response options. And what seems to be happening is they're looking at these response options and going back and forth, and in a way, sort of just guessing which one seems to be the correct one, where the high performers tend to do less of that, and they hone in pretty immediately on the correct answer based on where they decide to look initially, or so it seems. Obviously, this is preliminary research, and we want to do a lot more work in this area, but it gives us the full extent of how eye tracking might be able to help us understand the problems that students are having. And we could employ some strategies to help them from this data. For instance, we should maybe be pairing high and low performers together. We could always replay the scan pass of the high performers and have them talk through what they're doing. Performers can start emulating maybe some of those behaviors. And of course, giving students time to practice and reflect on what is it that they're doing and where might they be going wrong. And so with that, I want to bounce back to Eli because he's going to take this project to the next step. And he has some really nice project that he's formulating right now with some colleagues at other places in the country who are designing some experiments to be used in the classroom to really get at how students navigate geologic blocks and get at how spatial thinking may be a part of that. So go ahead, Eli.
Yeah, so like Karen said, I'll be collaborating with practitioners who are just interested in this idea of physical block diagrams or physical block models and these digital block models. So what I'll basically be doing is testing their spatial ability, students' spatial ability before they come to do this study. They'll have an activity that they have to engage in that is supposed to be teaching them geologic block models, how to understand what these block models look like on the interior. This is the skill penetrative thinking that Karen was talking about in the previous study. And the goal here really is to compare the efficacy of physical block models and digital block models. Some research questions that we have include, how does their attention to various components of the 3D block diagrams differ with treatment? So how does that differ between physical models and digital models? Are there any characteristics in the 3D block diagrams that students look at that support performance on this geologic block cross-sectioning test? So the test that was eye tracked in the previous study, we're going to look at that as well and use it as a pre-post measure of success in solving penetrative thinking challenges. The next research question is, are there certain distractors or errors that are more prevalent based on the treatment group? So we saw the errors that students may have been making, parallelogram errors. We have those now, and we have those areas of interest. We're going to use those to see if some errors are more prevalent, if they're doing a digital, or if they're using a digital block model versus a physical block model. The implications here are large, especially if we have something that's digital, something that's widely accessible for students. So this is huge for classroom opportunities. You may only have a few physical geologic block models, but if the virtual models are as effective at training this penetrative thinking and understanding geologic block diagrams, the implications here are huge. So using this study, we're going to apply it to the classroom and basically determine, how can these models affect penetrative thinking and affect geologic block model learning and cross-sectioning learning. So these are the goals going forward, and I'm going to be heavily involved in this project. This is one of the chapters of my dissertation. So I'm very excited to get started working with this.
Awesome. Thanks, Eli. And so I know I've said a lot. I hope I didn't overwhelm. I just want to kind of take a step back and give you some take-home messages. And really, the main message is that as educators, we have the responsibility to make changes in our teaching practices to remove the barriers and to attract and support all learners. And so as we continue to get information, we should continue to modify our teaching so that we can do the best we can, especially in supporting and recruiting underrepresented minorities. And that we are doing some of that now, and that is great, but obviously there's room for growth. And that one of those areas could be active learning, because we know based on this data that I presented that does engage students. And we should also be thinking about these challenges that tend to be, those skills that students need to succeed. And how can we better train and support students in those skills? And really, I hope that one of the things that I talked about was that geoscience education can really be a vessel to help you improve your instruction. If you have a question that you want answered in your own classroom, reach out to me, reach out to another geoscience educator, because there's that relationship between practitioner and geoscience education researcher that is imperative for this work. So with that, I just have my shameless plug for the NSF NRT Climate Resilience Program that we have at Auburn. If you know anyone who's looking into going into graduate school, we do have a recruitment webinar on November 13th. If you're interested in learning more, go to our website. You can scan it with your phone here, or feel free to reach out to me after the talk. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing because I think Robert wants to do the Q&A. And I really do thank you all for your attention, especially in this virtual format. Oh, you're on mute, Robert.
Thank you. So I just shared the slide so I can capture all of our Q&A stuff. But before we get into that, I just would like to mention that the Department of Geology and Geophysics and the Oceanography and Coastal Sciences Department were instrumental in getting this talk together. So I just want to thank them and thank Karen again. So I guess we can start in on some questions. Our first question is from Chris Delia, the Dean, and he wants to know about how Eli became interested in the geosciences and pursuing a PhD. So
Sure, Eli, go ahead.
Feel free to take this one.
Yeah, absolutely. So I got my bachelor's in earth science from JMU, James Madison University. But before that, I was biophysical chemistry. And I honestly did not enjoy it. I took one, I was exploring new majors, new options, and I took one geoscience class, and the professor just captivated me, and that made me want to get into the geosciences. So I talked to the chair of the department and met with a few other faculty, and ultimately changed my major from biophysical chemistry to earth science. What got me involved specifically with geoscience education was that I needed a project, like kind of a capstone project for the major. And I knew I wanted to teach. I knew that that's something that I was really, really passionate about. But I didn't even know that GER existed, that it was a thing. So I was talking with one of the faculty there, Kristen St. John, and I was going to start a paleoclimate project, and she directed me, after hearing what I was passionate about and what I wanted to do, she directed me to Shelley Whitmire. And we ended up collaborating on an augmented reality sandbox project, namely creating an augmented reality sandbox kind of exhibit for the Explore More Discovery Children's Museum in Harrisonburg. And we collected some data from that and just got the kids' engagement. I had a great time doing it. And in connecting with Shelley and connecting with another former colleague of Karen's, I ended up getting in contact with Karen and learning, what the possibilities were in geoscience and geoscience education. So that was my pathway into the geoscience education. As you see, I still have other interests with GIS and GIS and health, and I'm able to also pursue those. So I think having this flexibility and still be able to pursue my passions has been great. So, yeah.
Thank you for that answer. And by the way, I think that you're in one of the early slides, there was some mention that you're doing some work related to the urban heat island effect. And I know a little bit about that. So if you want to, email me sometime, just come through. Maybe I could at least take a look at something if you're interested.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah.
Okay, so we have a bunch of other questions. So let's get to those. So Another question that we can go to is, sorry, there's like a lot of questions, so I'm scrolling. Let's see. So this question is from Jill Tapizza, and it's to Dr. McNeil. And you pointed out that supporting low performing students based on data is done the least by instructors. Do you have any recommendations for the best ways to go about doing this, I guess, supporting low performing students, and especially for students that might be sensitive about their grades?
Right, sure. So, you know, it is definitely a challenge, and I've had some examples here at Auburn that I can provide. So one thing that the faculty did in physics actually was he would meet their students, obviously not in COVID-19 area, in the dining halls, and he would have study sessions in the dining halls with them. And so it was really the instructor coming to the students and giving them opportunities to work with him and not having to come to him during office hours. And I think that that's a great example. Another example is what I've seen done at the University of South Carolina, where they have students living in what's called Green Quad. So they tend to be in their School of Marine, Earth, and Environmental Sciences, and they're living together so they can bring the tutoring resources to them, to their dorms. And that is one way. And it may not be directly you as the instructor, but having knowledge that these things exist and even being in partnership with some other organizations on campus and having obviously a tutoring pool could be good. Another thing we've done here at Auburn is Learning Assistance program. And learning assistants are undergraduates who have taken the class and so have already hopefully done well in the class, and they are available. It's not just tutoring, but they actually come to class and help the students, especially if you have an active learning class, they can be helpful to the instructor. So they're helping the students solve whatever problem you're giving them or do the group work, so that as an instructor, you can do active learning. Because one of the things might be, well, I can't facilitate all of these students all at once. Well, that's where the LAs come in, and they can help be your kind of teaching assistants in a way, but they're undergraduates, so they're the near peers, and they can also help the students through maybe some trouble points. Those are a few examples. There are many, many others. And I guess the one with the data issue would be, for instance, if we have an advising office in our college. So like if I know a student struggling, I'm sure to reach out to their advisor that they've been assigned in the college, and they can follow up with the student as well and kind of give that extra level of support that I may not be able to find out what's going on with them. Is there something else going on that we just may not be aware of as instructors and things like that?
Okay, thank you. Our next question is from Sunity Kronotalaki from our Geology and Geophysics department. This is a technical question. It's how sensitive is the electrodermal response to variations in relative humidity, air currents, or ambient temperature across a classroom? I also have a small question about that too that I'll ask at the end.
That's a really great question. I didn't present it, but we actually record temperature data. It records a accelerometer it has built in, as well as a temperature meter with the conductivity reading. So when we get the data back, we can carefully monitor the temperature, if there's been any temperature changes within the classroom, if they've obviously been moving more. Those are important things to know. Now within a classroom, you can kind of control, well, you're probably not going to be playing tennis in the middle of class. So you know that you've somewhat controlled the mobility. There's not a whole lot of that happening, at least in a typical large lecture classroom. The temperature in our case, didn't really vary very much in our classroom that we were in. Again, it's only 50 minutes or upwards to an hour and 15 at most. But we do monitor that before we analyze the data. Now, we do not have relative humidity data, but all of these things are happening within the classroom itself. So it is an air-conditioned space.
I was also wondering if there's kind of a ceiling for what the measurements could be. Like, is there kind of a highest value that you might expect for an individual? Is there any variability in that?
So part of the reason we have a high standard deviation is because we all have different skin conductance readings. I'm actually a very low skin conductance reading person, so my readings are always quite low. I've seen like less than 1 microsiemen, but I have seen people up to 20 microsiemens. And so the variation can be high. And there are things that we can't really control for that can, you didn't bring this up, but I'll go ahead and bring it up. Like they could be taking some drugs that are prescription drugs or other things that might interfere with some of this activity. And, you know, those are certainly things we could ask students. I didn't feel comfortable in this last study asking that, but that is something that could be asked in the future. If we want to be sure we've controlled for any of those sorts of potential impacts on the nervous system.
So I guess the takeaway there is that there are lots of hidden variables, but we can still do a consistent statistical analysis as long as we account for their existence.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So our co-sponsor, Jonathan Snow, has a question. Do you see a method for adapting these kinds of observations to geologic field work?
So you're talking about in the field, like in the outdoor environment?
I think so. Jonathan, if you can cooperate, that would be nice. You always unmute or send me a message.
Yeah, there he goes.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I was thinking. That is, do you think there's, all right, so maybe I just don't know how sensitive it is to the classroom environment. Could you adapt that kind of method to judging the efficacy of field methods or field teaching methods?
Yeah, so the eye tracking, I really have been looking for an opportunity to do it. The downside is because it's infrared light, it doesn't work well in direct sunlight, although I've been told by the manufacturer that if you wore a large hat, I'm thinking like a sombrero, you might be able to collect that. We have eye tracking glasses that you put on your face, so you don't have to be tethered to a computer to do it. And that it may work out well, or at least a big cap, that maybe we can collect some data so that the glasses themselves don't have direct sunlight coming in on them. Yeah, did you have another question? Go ahead. No, okay.
No, that was it. No, well, or you could do it in Scotland where the sun doesn't shine.
Oh, well, there you go. That's right. And I've been wanting to go to Scotland with McNeil, my last name.
I would also love to put in a budget for about 50 sombreros, I think.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, that would be a great study. Yeah, definitely cloudy days, it'd probably be fine. But I have yet to try it out, and I would like to do that.
Okay, our next question is from Ariel Petchel. And she was asking if you could talk a little bit more about your research with climate change graphics and what recommendations you might have for researchers communicating climate change.
Yeah, and so this is a great plug. Thank you for the party talk that I'm giving at GSA that will be on Friday, the Friday of GSA. But basically, we've done some eye tracking with climate change graphics, IPCC graphics that we've modified based on cognitive science recommendations for accessibility. And one thing that we've seen, which is really interesting, is that as you change the figures to be incorporating both text and the imagery, and you draw people's attention to the data, you can actually influence their perceptions of climate science while you're doing that. So what we have found is that when we made these changes to the graphs, just trying to get people to pay attention to some of the data features within the graph, when we pre-posted them about their perceptions of the credibility of science and their perceptions of the risk of climate change, both of those factors went up in a statistically significant way. So figures can be very important for what you want to get across in the cognitive interpretation of data and information, but it also, based upon how they're perceived, can also change these other perceptions of people, which we didn't expect and we were really interested about.
That's a great outcome considering it wasn't what you were looking for.
Right. We measured it thinking maybe, but we were surprised when it actually changed.
That was a great call on your part.
Yeah.
Ariel has a follow-up question, which is, have there been any studies on the retention of LGBTQ students in the geosciences? And are there ways that we can better support those students based on research?
A lot of this work has been done in biology. I'm trying to think biology is the main field that has been doing a lot of this work in STEM, and maybe some physics as well. I've run across a few researchers. There are a lot of things we can do. It's not an area of research I've been working on, but things that I have read and also heard presentations of, you know, the group work can actually be quite stressful for LGBTQ students because sometimes people can do things that is exclusive, even if they're not sure, don't know what it is, and sometimes it can be directly exclusive. Also pronoun use and different things like that have become something to think about as instructors. But I'm happy to direct you to some resources and papers if you want to know more about that particular area of work, because people are doing that work. In the geosciences, I'm not as aware of as many publications that have been, or I haven't actually seen too many talks either that have been conducted within our field.
How should everyone get in contact with you? I'm going to put my email in just so I could facilitate things like that.
Let me put it in the chat. And then go ahead, you can go ahead and start with the next question. There is another one.
So I think that was the last official question, but if anyone has a question, now's a good time to bring it up. Well, there are lots of things that we could dig into.
Can I weigh in for a second? I would like
Yeah.
to know what kinds of opportunities you might see for us to collaborate. I think we have a lot of common interests, and I think more inter-university collaborations could be very effective in, for example, helping to give our students opportunities elsewhere. One area that comes to my mind is we have wonderful undergraduate students and who, if they went to Auburn, got a PhD, could come back and become members of our faculty and vice versa. So that kind of thing comes to mind. Any other ideas?
Yeah, and also RU programs. So we've recently been funded for some RU programs that the college has. So if there's ways of providing those experiences to your undergraduates that we can work for or work towards so that they get that exposure. Sometimes it's people need to see what the place is like before they commit to coming. And that's one way to both get research experience and see what the campus is like that they may want to go to graduate school in. Also, I mean, I'm a geoscience education researcher, and so I'm always interested in different issues that you may be seeing in your own classroom that may be of interest, such as Jonathan, who brought up maybe doing some field work. I'd also be interested, I've worked with GeoForce, which is a program out of the University of Texas that brings students of underrepresented populations and gives them in high school. So it's 3 years where they commit and they get to go on these trips across the country to see geosciences for themselves, and they're fully funded. I would love to bring something like that to the Southeast US. It does have an industry component. It's often industry funded, but that's a great way of kind of breaking the K-12 barrier that we tend to have in the geosciences, and then giving them exposure to our universities at the same time, opportunities, and also that career linkage of here's not just all the great things we do in our lab, but here are things that you can do in the career. And I think also letting people know that it's not always about field work. There's lots of work that we do as geosciences that's about lab work and GIS work, and we do a lot of different things as geosciences, as scientists. So those are a couple of ways I can think of. And also this NRT program, I don't want to not say something about that. Obviously, Louisiana is a great climate resilience place. A lot of climate things happening there. And we would, if you're interested as either a graduate student, but also a faculty member, we would love to hear from you. And I'll also speak with my other hat as part of the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. Auburn is a consortium institution, and I'm the working group leader for the Coastal Resilience Working Group that has just been forming within that center. And so if you have interest in that, I would also love to hear from you, because that's a way of working together and also bringing in this idea of how do we recruit underrepresented students, and certainly these sorts of kind of in the press topics that have those coastal and community impacts And also there's a strong environmental justice aspect, especially around the coastal environment, that we can certainly be doing more work in.
Well, I am your counterpart in the South Central Climate Adaptation Center. So there is a chance for us to work across the adaptation centers.
That would be great.
I think there's a lot of potential for us all to work together. So certainly everyone can get in touch with our email. And if anyone who's watching this, by the way, thank you to everyone for tuning in. You can always email me and I can send it to where you want it to go if you're not sure who to email. So I can facilitate these interactions.
And I just like to thank everybody again for your attention. It's weird not being there in person to engage everybody, but I hope maybe once all this COVID stuff is where it's behind, engage maybe face to face.
You have an open invitation. So when that happy day arrives, we'll see you.
Sounds wonderful. Thank you.
All right. I think this is a good place to close it out. So thanks everyone for coming, and hopefully see you next week.